Is wait and see right now, and at this point she has not been charged in Minnesota. But one of the big fights here in this trial is whether or not the judge was going to let the jury hear about any of the past alleged bad acts or alleged crimes that prosecutors wanted to bring up. And today we did see that detective get on the stand, and he certainly was able to talk a lot about what they knew about that investigation and the fact that it has now been reopened. All right, and the third big piece that came out in court today, which we've all kind of been waiting for, because when Joseph Hartsfield died, the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office ended up doing the autopsy. And the autopsy had to be peer reviewed. So his death was in January. It wasn't until the end of March that we actually learned his cause of death. And at that point, according to the Medical Examiner's Office, his cause of death was ruled complications of toxic effects of insulin. So the medical examiner, the doctor who actually did the autopsy and went through all of the records and said she literally observed and inspected his brain, she was on the stand inside the courthouse today as well. And she said without a doubt that there was too much insulin in his body that led to a cascade of events that ultimately resulted in Joseph Hartsfield's death. The defense was trying to say, well, maybe he had a stroke. Possibly he had a stroke based on medical professionals not being able to completely rule that option out. But again, according to the doctor who did the autopsy, it was because there was too much insulin in his body. Now, the manner of death has been a really big question here in this case because the manner was left undetermined. Of course, there are a few options that the medical examiner's office can put on those reports. It could be a homicide, a suicide, accidental, natural. You know, there are those types of rulings. But in this case, it was left undetermined. And the testimony from the doctor on that was that she couldn't make that determination without something like a piece of video or something that she saw with her own eyes to see exactly who injected Joseph Hartsfield with too much insulin. You know, we've been talking with our legal expert, Rick DeToto, throughout the week, and he said that that's possibly going to be a really big hole in the state's case. We will have to wait and see what the jury thinks about that. But since we're talking about insulin, we wanted to bring in a diabetes expert tonight. So I believe that we can bring her in now, Dr. Arthi Thangadu. She is in the studio back in Houston. Thank you so much for joining us, doctor. How are you tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. I know we've gone back and forth on this because I'm certainly not the medical expert, and I did not want to mess anything up with some of the testimony that we have heard in court. But I've shared with you a lot of the notes from what we've heard from the doctors. And I just want to start with this because, again, according to that medical examiner, it was too much insulin in Joseph Hartsfield's body. What does that mean? What happened if there was too much insulin in his body?
So that means that the insulin level was detected to be too high in his body on the in the toxicology report, which in a person with type 1 diabetes, the body doesn't make any insulin. So that would indicate that the person was injected with too much insulin, whether it was by himself or someone else.
So there's really no question about that. That is basically what that means.
Correct.
So, according to prosecutors, they have told us that his glucose level may have been low for about 20 hours, and that was all based on his Dexcom, which is the glucose monitor that he had. If his glucose was really that low for 20 hours, what does that mean?
So when somebody has a low glucose and they're wearing a continuous glucose monitoring system like a Dexcom, it will alert them based on the reference range that they've set for themselves. So he should have been alerted that his blood sugar was low. Sometimes these devices can misread, in which cases patients should do a capillary blood glucose. That's what we think of as a finger stick blood glucose to check. But if his blood sugar was low for that long, we would expect him to be trying to correct it, trying to get help, trying to do whatever he could to bring that blood sugar back to a normal level.
So he would have known that his blood sugar was that low, most likely?
More than likely, yes. Unless, you know, he was...
We heard this...
Sorry, unless he was so low that he was not cognitively aware, if he was passed out or something like that.
Yeah, we have heard testimony about that, and sorry, there's just a little bit of a delay, so I'm not trying to talk over you. But we did hear some testimony that there were other potential drugs in his system, according to the toxicology reports. There were three that the prosecutor rattled off in court today. One was Valium, which would be a benzodiazepine. That was the testimony that we heard. We also heard about Benadryl, which, again, I mean, most people know that makes you drowsy, an allergy medication. And then also ropinirole was the other one, which could, I guess, make people drowsy. Am I right on that?
Yeah, so definitely the Valium and the Benadryl could impair people's cognitive function and make them drowsy.
Okay. We heard this talk yesterday in court about hypoglycemia unawareness or awareness, and I want to get your take on that because is there anything that would cause Joseph Hartsfield to possibly not have a sense of his dropping or low sugar level?
Yes, so many patients with type 1 diabetes or any type of diabetes really, especially if they're on insulin, if they frequently experience hypoglycemia or low blood sugar, they can lose the sensation of what we call hyperadrenergic symptoms. Those are symptoms where people just feel icky. They feel clammy, shaky, nervous, agitated, hungry, those types of things. And that's usually when the blood sugar is low, like 70 to 55. And then lower than 55, we actually see neuroglycopenic symptoms. That means the brain is not getting enough sugar, in which case people can pass out or even die.
You mentioned the 70 and the 55, and that reminded me of something else that we heard in court, actually. So these Dexcom monitors, how common are they, by the way?
In my practice, they're very common because we deal with so many patients with diabetes. But I think they're fairly common. They're getting more and more common every year.
Yeah, one of the doctors that was here actually testified that Dexcoms save lives. So it seems like they are pretty common. But what we heard in court is that Joseph Hartsfield, he really did not like it when his sugar ran low. He had a fear or anxiety of his sugar level getting too low. And the testimony that we heard was that he had actually adjusted the settings on his glucose monitor. So apparently the factory settings are normally at 55 when you would get the alert for your sugar to be low. But in his case, according to the testimony, he had adjusted it so that he would start getting that alert when his sugar dipped below 70. And actually, we should clarify something because I'm saying these numbers and I want you to make sense of them. Like, what does 70 mean, or what would the average be in someone maybe before a meal? Sorry, there's a lot of bugs out here. But before a meal or after a meal?
Yeah, so a blood sugar of less than 70 is considered low, especially in a patient on insulin. We don't like seeing their blood sugar that low because of the symptoms we discussed that they can experience, or also the life-threatening emergencies that can occur from there. Between 70 and 100 is considered okay. We don't love our people living with type 1 diabetes too much lower than 100 either, because, that's just creeping to a dangerous spot. But most people, after a meal, everybody's different. So blood sugar is very variable, and normals for different people can be variable. So I don't want to give a number that's a blanket statement for everybody, but
right. Yeah.
But we typically accept blood sugars up to 140. Above that, we like to bring them down, and everybody has settings that are calibrated on their continuous glucose monitors and their insulin pumps if they're wearing one, based on their individual needs.
So with that in mind, these kind of average levels, and I totally get what you're saying, every person is different, every patient would be different. But if EMS got to their house and his blood sugar level, they did a finger prick, and his blood sugar was registering on their monitor at 22, what does that mean?
That's very, very low. We would expect him to be very confused, if not passed out already. And that is an extremely low number and very dangerous.
The defense was really trying to make the point throughout a lot of the testimony yesterday and getting these same doctors to testify about the same records that for years Joseph Hartsfield mismanaged his diabetes and did not follow the doctor's orders. They said that he wouldn't always take the full amount of prescribed insulin, or sometimes he would skip the doses altogether. And oh, by the way, one more thing. He had been diagnosed about 25 years ago with diabetes. So if, thinking about him having it for 25 years, and if he's had it for that long, and, he was consistently hyperglycemic, meaning his sugar level was higher than it should have been, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so if he was continuously hyperglycemic, could this have suddenly led to like a sudden death? Like he had? Like, would the complications have been that bad at that point?
So diabetes is a chronic disease that has microvascular complications that occur over time. So people living with diabetes, especially if their diabetes is not well controlled, they're chronically hyperglycemic, they can have higher risk of things like heart attack and stroke, which, as we know, can lead to sudden cardiac death, a stroke. So having poorly controlled diabetes for a long time could lead to sudden death.
Okay. And you mentioned stroke, and like I said, that was visible on some of the hospital records that were presented in court today, but the doctors that testified said, they just couldn't, based on everything that they knew, they couldn't for sure rule out a stroke, so it was listed, but the primary reason for his hospitalization when he went to the ER, according to the records that we saw, was because of the hypoglycemia, and again, possibly for 20 hours. We also heard that Joseph Hartsfield had been in the hospital a couple of times in the year leading up to his death for DKA. Can you break that down for us? What does that mean, and why would he have had to be hospitalized for that? And could that have been connected to something that happened, his death, months later?
Yeah, so DKA is a very severe complication of diabetes. It usually occurs in type 1 diabetes. It sometimes occurs in type 2 diabetes, but it is due to insulin deficiency. So if somebody is consistently not taking their insulin or taking too little insulin, they can wind up in a state that's called diabetic ketoacidosis. And in this state, the body builds ketone bodies that eventually make the blood acidotic, which is very dangerous to the entire system. So, however, this is usually associated with high blood sugar, not usually hypoglycemia. However, there are some cases of what we call euglycemic DKA, which is the blood sugar is normal, but a patient is in DKA. So there are different pathophysiologies of what occurred prior in his previous hospitalizations, which it was actually a deficiency of insulin versus what we're talking about now, which was excess insulin.
We've also heard a lot of testimony about his A1C and how his A1C, I believe it's a percentage, has been higher than what would be considered normal or average. What does that mean? And in this particular case, could that have been something, again, that would have led to this sudden hospitalization and prolonged time being in hypoglycemia?
So an elevated A1C means that on average for the last 3 months approximately, the patient had an elevated blood sugar. Now, it is an average, right? So that could mean that the patient is persistently elevated, like they're constantly living at 400, or their average is an average of lows and highs. So it doesn't give us minute by minute information, but it gives us an estimate of the average and risk of complications. So based on an A1C, we don't really know if he was just always high or if he was having a lot of glycemic variability with lows and highs together, even if his average was high.
That makes sense. I appreciate you making sense of all of this because, yeah, I'm hearing this testimony in court, and of course I'm no medical expert, and The doctors are breaking it down really well for the jury, but then to come out here and explain it on the camera, I'm so glad you're here to help us understand this a little bit better. I want to ask you also about these insulin pens, because this has been a really key point, I would say, of this case. At the beginning, there was a search warrant that we obtained. And in that search warrant, it said that the investigators who went to the Hartsfield couple's home, they found up to 10 insulin pens on his side of the bed. There's been a lot of question. Were they short-acting? Were they long-acting? Were the caps on? Were they empty? There are still a lot of questions, and I don't know that we have all of those answers yet. But according to what the deputy said who testified today, and that body camera video that we showed when he was interviewing her there in the hospital, she told the first officer that she gave an interview to that she gave him 2 insulin pens at his request, and then she doesn't know if they were long-acting or fast-acting. What difference would that make?
So most people with type 1 diabetes use 2 types of insulin, as you mentioned, long-acting and short-acting. So long-acting insulin is also called basal insulin, and short-acting is what people might give at meal times or if they're high. But they are very dangerous if they are confused. And I have seen this happen with patients, because oftentimes the long-acting dose is much higher than what a person would take with a meal. Like, let's say a person takes 40 units of basal long-acting insulin once a day, and then 12 units with each meal. You know, that's a big difference, 12 units versus 40 units. So if a patient accidentally was to take their basal dose and was to give themselves the basal dose in a short-acting pen, that would be a very, very high dose of insulin that would act very rapidly and could cause profound hypoglycemia.
And if someone were to have those 3 drugs that I mentioned in their system, the Valium, Benadryl, and Ropinirole, could that have led to any, I guess, drowsiness or confusion in figuring out what kind of insulin they should have been using at that point, or what was on the box or the pen?
Yeah, absolutely. So how these pens work is they have a little dial on them. And so a patient has to be, they have to be able to see well, and they need to have good manual dexterity to work them well. And they need to be cognitively alert. They need to know what they're doing, because, you know, it's an easy click to get to the wrong dose. And so if somebody their vision is impaired, their cognition is impaired, and their manual dexterity is impaired, which all could happen with some of those medications, they could certainly give themselves an inaccurate dose, or perhaps give themselves the wrong type of insulin.
So it could be kind of easy to inject too much if you're not paying the closest attention. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, it could be. And we do see it clinically where patients accidentally incorrectly dose themselves with insulin.
We are getting some questions, I think, in the YouTube live chat. One that I just saw that popped in. I keep looking down here at the computer. Do insulin pens have to be refrigerated? If so, why would 10 be put out and next to the bed? How is insulin stored?
Yes, so they do have to be refrigerated, but not immediately. They can stay out of the fridge for several hours and sometimes even days, depending on if they've been opened, if they've been used yet or not. You know, for safety purposes, I wouldn't recommend keeping multiple pens in the same place, because you could get confused easily. But realistically, it is possible that someone could have multiple pens out at the same time.
Okay. When you are dealing with your patients normally, I mean, are they sleeping with 10 pens next to them on the insulin, or next to them on the bedside table, or how does that usually? How do you recommend they store it, I guess?
I sure hope they aren't, because that's very confusing. And I would recommend that they put their insulin back in a safe place, because not only could they get confused, you know, pets, children, all kinds of people could get into it who couldn't. So I think most people are storing their insulin safely in the refrigerator and carefully, because we try to counsel patients as best as we can at how high risk these medications are.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to go back to one thing, and I think you've already kind of answered it briefly, but I think it's an interesting point here, and we still have a lot of testimony to hear, is that according to what Sarah herself told investigators was that, she was asleep, in and out of sleep, recovering from surgery on those narcotic medications, and that she heard Joe getting up, walking around, using the bathroom, and then she also thought that he was taking care of those Dexcom alerts, the glucose monitor alerts, because apparently there was a glass of orange juice that had been set out on their counter, and she said that she thought he was drinking it to boost his sugar level, and then she would refill it, and she assumed that he was drinking it. If the data from that Dexcom monitor is showing, again, that the level, his glucose level was so low for so long, would that to you be a realistic level of activity?
So if a person's blood sugar is really 20, no, it wouldn't. It would be very unlikely that they would be cognitively and physically able to drink a glass of water and manage the alerts. One caveat to that, though, is sometimes the Dexcom readings are off, right? It's reading a lower number than what a capillary finger stick is. So what we always recommend, if a patient is alert and oriented and their blood sugar reading is 20, well, that doesn't make much sense. So they should be doing a finger stick. So we can't rely 100% on the Dexcom readings. However, patterns are very telling when we have a continuous glucose monitor. And so if he had been high and the sensor seemed to be working well and then was low, that would indicate that it was more accurate compared to other data that might tell us that it wasn't accurate.
Obviously, so much of this is based on the data and based on the records, and I want to get your perspective on this because it seems like some of these doctors that have got up to testify, they have not, they don't want to say exactly one thing or exactly another thing. It's like they are maybe trying to rule certain things out, and every patient may be different, and just talk to me kind of from the doctor's perspective. Why is it maybe troublesome or bad to just have such like hard lines about exactly what something is or isn't, if that makes sense, my question?
Well, the thing with insulin levels is we don't have a test that can tell us, okay, if I check your blood now, I know that you injected 20 units. We don't have that type of test available commercially. So it's very difficult for us to say, did he become hypoglycemic because he injected way too much insulin for himself from our standard tests? Now, I understand that toxicology probably does have other tests that might give them that information that aren't commercially available. But I think that does make it very difficult for us to say, did he take his regular dose? Did he not take his regular dose? Was something else going on? Sometimes illness can make people have a higher propensity for hypoglycemia. Things like adrenal insufficiency that may not have been diagnosed could cause hypoglycemia. So, there are other reasons that a patient may have hypoglycemia in addition to taking too much insulin.
And one more thing here that's come to mind, because Joseph Hartsfield, he was 46 when he died. Again, the testimony from these doctors has been that he didn't really manage his diabetes very well, even before he met Sarah, and he loved to eat, and he didn't really have his diet fully in check. There's some testimony that also came in from a doctor that one time Joe had a virtual visit with a doctor, and Sarah was there for the virtual visit as well. I guess she was involved in it in some way, and then afterwards, apparently that doctor said that Sarah individually called the doctor's office and told the doctor, he didn't tell you exactly the right thing about how much insulin he's taking, and he's not taking the dose that he says he's taking. From your experience, are spouses usually that involved in someone's like diabetes care, or is that usually something that maybe just like the person deals with on their own? Do you kind of have a sense for that?
Yes. So one thing I want to say before I answer that question is that type 1 diabetes, while diet does matter, it does affect blood sugar, of course, people still need insulin. And sometimes there's a misconception that, a person did this to themselves or their diet was poor and that's why they are dealing with these blood sugar issues. Whereas in type 1 diabetes, it is true insulin deficiency due to an autoimmune disease where the body has attacked its own pancreas and made it not able to produce insulin. So I just want to make that point clear. As far as spouses and family members being engaged in diabetes management, we actually do see that very often. Some people do go about their own diabetes management on their own, but many times the family is involved because diet, nutrition, lifestyle is often revolves around the whole family. So we do see spouses involved, often parents, of course, because many people living with type 1 diabetes, or many of them are children. We have many daughters often are involved in type 1 diabetes management and their parents. So I don't think it's unusual to have a spouse involved. If that was my patient, I would encourage maybe communication with the patient present, but given the dynamic of the circumstance, maybe that wasn't what was appropriate in that case.
Do you also see spouses who are maybe like in charge of administering their diabetic partner's insulin, or is that more so the individual person who takes care of their insulin?
I see that all the time. Yeah, a lot of patients, especially some people are older and may not have that manual dexterity or may not feel comfortable injecting themselves. Some people have needle phobia. Lots of reasons that other people are helping them with their injections.
One question, sorry to keep you, but we got another question on the YouTube live chat, and so I just want to check with you about this because of the Dexcom. There's been kind of some back and forth about the alarms that come from the Dexcom when you get to that low level of glucose. In this case, Joe did have those alerts turned on. Like I said, the testimony was that he had it set at 70 for the low alert. And apparently those alerts were also shared with his wife, with Sarah. I believe I read in some records that it was listed as bestest wife was how his Dexcom app was showing the person that it was shared with. Can you silence those alarms? This came up in court and it seemed a little confusing because the doctor, let's wait for that graphic. I want to talk about that in just a minute. But actually, wait a second. We could pull that back up because she's talking about these Dexcom alerts. That's a good one for this. Sorry, I thought that was the next one. One message that she sent me from jail, by the way, was that she did not ignore his Dexcom alerts. She was on her own pain regimen in another room after having another surgery. Joe knew I couldn't do anything for him. I was sleeping most of the day and night. Yeah, so she did send me that message from her jail cell back in 2023. After she got arrested and indicted, of course. So can you turn those alerts off? I mean, I don't know if that's fully a question because, again, in the testimony we heard from that deputy who interviewed her today, she said that she was hearing or paying attention to his alerts. But if you can turn those alerts off, just kind of tell us how those work.
Yeah, I mean, you could turn them off, or if you put your phone in another room, or if you're keeping your phone on silent, or there's plenty of ways to miss alerts on your phone, and so it is possible that if she didn't have her phone or wasn't able to hear her phone, she could have, or had her phone on silent, she may not have been hearing those, even though that's not exactly what she said.
Okay, yeah, there are a lot of questions, and of course everyone is fighting to make their points heard in court every day so that the jury can ultimately decide whether or not to convict her for allegedly killing her fifth husband in January of 2023. Doctor, before we let you go, any additional thoughts? I'm sure there's more that's going to be coming up in the trial. We might want to check in again, but anything before we let you go?
Yeah, I think this is so tragic, and it just gives us the a look into how important it is for patients to have great diabetes education and support in their care, because insulin, even though it's a common medication, probably everybody knows somebody who has used insulin at some point. Everybody knows somebody with diabetes, whether it be type 1 or type 2 or another type of diabetes. The medications are very potent and can be potentially life-threatening, so it drives home the importance of making sure that we educate our patients living with diabetes well and their families.
Yeah, for sure. There's so much to know. I feel like I'm like in a class learning about it, just sitting and listening to some of this testimony that we've heard, and doctors really trying to make it make sense for us. So thank you for helping it make sense to everyone who hasn't been able to sit in the courtroom and kind of hear how this has all unfolded. And of course, if more comes up from the doctors, I'm going to be calling you, and we might need to check in again. So thanks again, doctor.
Absolutely, anytime.
All right, we'll talk again soon. I know a lot of people have been asking about Sarah Hartsfield's demeanor in court, and I think there were a couple other questions that we got in the YouTube live chat. Is she making attempts to contact her family who is at the trial, is one that I see here. I don't know. I don't know if she's reached out to them since the trial has started. I do know from looking at the list of alleged bad acts that prosecutors are hoping to bring up that in May of this year, she may have tried to tamper with her son, Ryan, who's listed as a witness in this case. We don't know. We haven't heard any testimony on that. But since the trial has started, I really don't have a good sense of who she has or has not been in touch with. I certainly have not gotten any messages like I did back in 2023 when she had seen some of our stories on TV. And someone else asked if she's seen her kids or her family during the trial. I don't know. And I know you can't see the easiest behind me, but if you look behind me, there are a lot of windows here in this courthouse, and it's really small. I mean, the courtroom is on the 3rd floor. The bathroom is on the 2nd floor. During the breaks, you know, you're walking out the same entrance with the defense attorneys, or you're walking out next to one of the jurors. Of course, we can't interact with them, or you're even sometimes using the bathroom right next to those people. So I don't know what she can see or what she can't see from where they are keeping her when she's not in the courtroom. But none of the witnesses who are expected to testify, none of them have been into the courtroom because they haven't been called yet, and they're being asked to, you know, hang out and wait until it's time for them to be called to the stand. So yeah, her demeanor today, we did not see the Bible that we have seen, and she really did appear to continue to be pretty intent on listening to the testimony and paying attention to what these doctors had to say, and sometimes maybe like scowling at what one of the records shows that they're presenting to the jury. So she does still seem to be very engaged with what's going on here. And I do want to show you one other message that she had sent, again, back in 2023. She said in that message that, quote, all the lies, accusations that were no more than supposed hearsay and sheer hatred still couldn't keep the truth from rising to the top, even if I couldn't speak for myself. That's one of the messages that she sent. And of course, we have heard her attorney make several objections in court about what he perceives as hearsay. Some the judge has agreed with him on, others he has been overruled. So that was Sarah's message. And again, there's a lot that we've got to wait and see what will happen here. The jury has heard a lot in this case already. It's been a really packed week of testimony. But based on the witness list and based on who we've seen, there are still a lot more people to hear from. We, of course, will continue to be here in Chambers County every day of this trial. And we'll see you again tomorrow morning on KPRC 2 News. Have a good rest of the night.
Jurors also saw a piece of video today that has never